Fort Robinson, Nebraska. Late afternoon, September 5, 1877. A man is being walked toward a guardhouse door by soldiers he once fought and warriors he once called brothers. He does not know it yet, but he will not leave that yard alive. Behind him lies a record almost impossible to believe. A war leader who never lost a major battle he personally commanded, who helped annihilate an entire United States Army command in under 30 minutes, who forced one of the most decorated generals in the country to retreat without firing a decisive shot, and who, 5 days later, took part in wiping out 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry down to the last man on a ridge above a river the Army had never properly mapped. He was never photographed. Not once in 37 years of documented life. What happens in the next few minutes at that guardhouse door, who moves, who lies, who strikes, remains disputed by 17 eyewitnesses to this day. But to understand why a single Lakota horseman terrified the most powerful army on the continent, enough to end his life in a chaotic scuffle rather than risk him free for one more season, the record has to go back. Back to a boy who was never supposed to become the reason a president would eventually call for his surrender by name. This is the story of how the United States Army, armed with repeating rifles, telegraph lines, and a railroad system that could move 10,000 men in a week, was outthought, outmaneuvered, and humiliated by a man who left behind almost no writing, no portrait, and no surrender speech that historians fully trust. This is the record of how invisibility became a weapon. By 1866, the United States Army fielded roughly the most modern land force on the North American continent. Breech-loading rifles were replacing muzzle loaders across frontier garrisons. The Bozeman Trail was being fortified with 3 permanent posts: Fort Reno, Fort Phil Kearny, and Fort C.F. Smith, specifically to protect miners and settlers cutting through Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho hunting grounds in present-day Wyoming and Montana. The soldiers stationed there were veterans. Many had survived the Civil War. Captain William J. Fetterman, in particular, was not a cautious man. According to multiple contemporary accounts, he had boasted that a single company of 80 disciplined regulars could ride through the entire Sioux nation. That number, 80, would matter more than he could have imagined. On the other side of this asymmetry stood a young Oglala Lakota warrior, born around 1840 near Rapid Creek in what is now South Dakota, though the exact year remains debated even among his closest relatives. He was known in childhood as Curly, on account of hair that was lighter and softer than that of the other boys, a detail so unusual that some early observers mistook him, at a distance, for something other than fully Lakota. He inherited the name Crazy Horse, Tashunke Witko, from his father, a respected holy man. What Curly did not inherit was a taste for ornament, boasting, or leadership by spectacle. He rarely spoke in council. He wore no elaborate headdress into battle. He kept instead a single hawk feather, a smooth stone behind one ear, and lightning bolt markings drawn across his face and body. The residue of a vision that convinced him, and eventually convinced entire war parties, that he could not be killed in battle so long as he did not stop to plunder the dead. Here is the asymmetry laid bare. The United States Army understood territory in terms of forts, supply lines, and treaty boundaries drawn in Washington. It did not understand, could not understand, from inside its own institutional logic, those hills the way the people who had hunted them for generations did. Officers at Fort Phil Kearny knew there were hostile parties nearby. What they did not know, because no one had told them and no one there had learned to ask the right questions, was that those war parties had begun coordinating decoy tactics with a level of discipline the Army assumed only regular soldiers possessed. On December 21, 1866, A woodcutting detail from Fort Phil Kearny came under attack. Colonel Henry Carrington dispatched a relief column. 49 infantrymen, 27 mounted troopers, 2 civilians. Command, by seniority, fell to Fetterman. Carrington's orders were explicit: under no circumstances cross Lodge Trail Ridge. A small decoy party of 10 warriors drawn from 3 Lakota bands, the Cheyenne and the Arapaho, rode into view of Fetterman's column. Accounts differ on exactly who led that party, but Lakota oral testimony consistently places Crazy Horse among the decoys, and several accounts identify him at its head. The decoys taunted. They fell from their horses as though wounded. They dared the column forward. It worked. Fetterman crossed the ridge. What waited on the other side is worth pausing on, because the numbers here are precise where so much else about this era is not. Roughly 1,000 warriors, Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho combined, had concealed themselves along Pano Creek. Not scattered, not improvised, positioned. When Fetterman's infantry and Lieutenant Grumman's cavalry, following separate decoys, both found themselves encircled on the same slope, the trap closed from multiple directions at once. In under half an hour, all 81 men under Fetterman's command were dead. It remains, to this day, one of only a handful of engagements in United States military history in which an entire deployed command was annihilated. Newspapers back east called it a massacre. Military historians call it something else: proof of concept. The lesson the warriors carried away was not that white soldiers could be killed. Everyone already knew that. The lesson was that overconfidence could be engineered, harvested, and used as a weapon in its own right. That lesson would resurface 9.5 years later, on a scale the Army never saw coming. If the channel is showing you the kind of research most documentaries skip, this is the moment to make sure you don't miss what's coming. The subscribe button costs nothing, and what happens next changes the entire shape of the American West. By 1876, the context had shifted, but the underlying pattern had not. Gold had been discovered in the Black Hills in 1874, in direct violation of the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868, which had guaranteed that territory to the Lakota as sacred and inviolable land. Miners poured in. The government, unable or unwilling to stop them, instead issued an ultimatum. All Lakota and Northern Cheyenne bands were to report to reservation agencies by January 31st, 1876, or be classified as hostile. Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull refused. Thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho gathered instead along the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers. Eventually, by some estimates, more than 10,000 people, with somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 able warriors among them. It was, by any measure, one of the largest concentrations of Plains Indian military strength ever assembled in one place. The United States response came in 3 columns, a classic pincer strategy designed to converge on the encampment from separate directions. General George Crook from the south, General Alfred Terry, and Colonel John Gibbon from the east and west, with Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's 7th Cavalry attached to Terry's column. It was, on paper, overwhelming force. It assumed on the ground that the Lakota and their allies would do what most displaced peoples facing a modern army were expected to do: scatter or wait to be found. On June 17, 1876, Crook's column of roughly 1,000 soldiers, alongside Crow and Shoshone scouts, encountered a force of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors along Rosebud Creek, a force led in significant part by Crazy Horse, estimated at around 1,200 fighters. What followed was not a skirmish. It was 6 hours of sustained mobile combat across broken terrain, warriors advancing and withdrawing in coordinated waves rather than the massed frontal charges the army expected and was prepared to break. Crook, unable to press forward, unable even to hold his position with confidence, withdrew. He did not resume the offensive for nearly 7 weeks. What that meant, in practical terms, was devastating for the army's overall strategy. One of the 3 converging columns had been removed from the board entirely, 8 days before the battle everyone remembers. Custer did not know this. Nobody in Terry's column knew this. That is the detail almost every retelling of what happened next glosses over, and it deserves to be named plainly. When the 7th Cavalry rode toward the valley of the Little Bighorn on the morning of June 25, 1876, its commanders believed a second army column might still be closing from the south to help finish the fight. It was not coming. It could not come. It had already been turned back, bloodied 8 days earlier, by the same tactical mind that was now waiting downriver. Custer's Crow scouts warned him the village ahead was the largest they had ever seen. He did not fully believe them. From a distant ridge, all he could see was a pony herd and women beginning the morning's work. Nothing that, to his eye, suggested the numbers his own scouts were describing. This was not arrogance in the simple sense. It was doctrine. Custer had built a career on the assumption that boldness against indigenous forces was rewarded, because it usually had been. He split his 12 companies into 3 battalions and pressed forward without waiting for Terry and Gibbon, without full reconnaissance, and without any accurate count of what waited in the valley below. What waited was somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 warriors, organized not around a single chief, but around several war leaders working in loose coordination, Crazy Horse and Gall foremost among them, with Sitting Bull already established as a revered spiritual leader, having led the sun dance weeks earlier that many present believed had foretold this very victory. Major Marcus Reno's battalion struck the southern end of the village first and was driven back across the river in disarray within minutes. Custer's own battalion of roughly 210 men pushed north, apparently intending to strike the village from a different angle or seize hostages. Accounts differ, and no soldier from that battalion survived to clarify the plan. Here is where the open loop from the very beginning of this account closes. Custer's greatest asset throughout his career had been speed, the ability to strike before an enemy could organize a coherent response. At the Little Bighorn, that asset inverted completely. The warriors he faced were not disorganized villagers caught by surprise. They were already mobilizing, already mounted, already converging from multiple directions, before his battalion had finished its approach. Cheyenne oral tradition holds that Buffalo Calf Roadwoman was among those who struck Custer from his horse. Lakota accounts describe the fighting on what is now called Custer Hill as brief, chaotic, and total. The encirclement tactic first proven at the Fetterman Fight a decade earlier, executed now at a scale involving hundreds rather than dozens. Within roughly an hour, every man in Custer's immediate command was dead. Not driven back, not scattered, erased. It was and remains the most significant defeat inflicted on the United States Army in the entirety of the Plains Indian Wars. A defeat achieved not through superior weaponry, since many warriors still carried bows alongside captured or traded rifles, but through terrain knowledge, coordinated maneuver, and an accurate read of an opposing commander's psychology that his own superiors did not possess. The nation's reaction was not admiration. It was fury, arriving within days of the country's own centennial celebrations. What followed was not a single retaliatory strike, but a sustained, resourced, winter campaign designed to make survival itself impossible for any band that had not surrendered. Villages were burned, Pony herds were destroyed. The Army's new strategy did not attempt to defeat Crazy Horse in open battle again. It simply removed the conditions under which his people could continue to live free. By January 8, 1877, at the Battle of Wolf Mountain, roughly 600 of Crazy Horse's remaining fighters engaged 450 soldiers under Colonel Nelson Miles in a blizzard along the Tongue River. The fighting itself was inconclusive. The message behind it was not. There would be no more seasons of rest, no more safe winter camps, no end to the pursuit. By May 1877, starvation had done what 6,000 rifles could not. Crazy Horse surrendered at Camp Robinson, Nebraska, bringing in roughly 1,100 followers, the last major holdout band of the Northern Plains resistance. He was promised a reservation of his own choosing in the Powder River country. That promise was never honored. If this is the kind of detail you came here for, sourced, dated, and not smoothed over for convenience, subscribing means you'll be here for the next one too, and it genuinely helps a channel like this keep doing the research the right way. What followed his surrender was not combat. It was something arguably more dangerous for a man like Crazy Horse: proximity to power without protection. His fame unsettled the very officers who had fought him and drew resentment from rival Lakota leaders, including Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, both of whom had already accommodated reservation life and had reason to see a still revered war leader as a threat to their own standing. Rumors spread, likely amplified by mistranslation, that Crazy Horse intended to break out and resume the war. In August 1877, when the Army asked him to help campaign against the fleeing Nez Perce, he reportedly responded, through an interpreter whose translation itself has been questioned, that he would fight until not a single Nez Perce remained. Whether that was a threat, a bitter joke, or a mistranslation entirely, it reached General Crook as evidence of imminent rebellion. Crook ordered his arrest. On September 4, 1877, soldiers moved on Crazy Horse's village and found it already scattered. He fled to the nearby Spotted Tail Agency with his ailing wife. The next day, persuaded to return to Camp Robinson under assurance of fair treatment, he was instead escorted directly toward the guardhouse by Captain James Kennington and a Lakota named Little Big Man, once an ally, by then working within the agency's police structure. The moment Crazy Horse recognized where he was being taken, he attempted to break free. What happened in the next several seconds has never been fully resolved. Little Big Man's own later account claims he deflected a knife Crazy Horse had drawn, accidentally driving it into the chief's own side. Nearly every other eyewitness among the roughly 17 recorded that evening places the fatal wound on the bayonet of a nearby sentry, generally identified as Private William Gentles, a 47-year-old Irish immigrant with 2 decades of largely unremarkable service. Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy, reaching him minutes later, found a wound above the hip already recognizable as mortal. Touch the Clouds, a towering Miniconjou leader present that night, refused to let his friend be dragged into the guardhouse cell, insisting a chief could not be imprisoned even in death. Crazy Horse was carried instead to the adjutant's office, laid on the floor by his own choice rather than a cot, and given morphine for the pain. His father, a holy man named Worm, sat beside him. According to those present, his final words were an apology of sorts to his people, that they could no longer depend on him. He died shortly before midnight. He was not yet 40 years old. His body was given to his parents. They buried him in a location they told no living person, bound by a shared vow among those present never to reveal it. More than a century later, despite searches, rumors, and at least one persistent claim tied to a site near Wounded Knee Creek, The resting place of Crazy Horse remains unknown, the final, unintended continuation of a pattern that had defined his entire life. No portrait, no signature on any treaty, no known grave. A man who spent 37 years refusing to be captured, in every sense the word allows, right up to the manner of his own burial. There is a temptation, looking back, to reduce this record to a single image. A warrior on horseback, a feather, a name that sells posters and license plates. That temptation misses what the record actually shows. Crazy Horse did not defeat the United States Army through mysticism, though he clearly believed in the protective power of his own visions, and though that belief demonstrably steadied warriors who fought beside him. He defeated columns of it, repeatedly, through discipline the Army assumed only its own uniforms could produce. Coordinated decoys, terrain command, and an almost forensic understanding of what a confident enemy would do if given the chance to feel safe. The tragedy embedded in his death is not that he was killed by a soldier's blade, rather than in the kind of battle he had spent his life fighting. It is that the very qualities that made him unconquerable in the field, his refusal to be photographed, documented, contained, or predicted, were the same qualities that made him impossible for his own government, and eventually his own captors, to simply leave alone. Empires rarely fear the enemy they can see clearly. They fear the one who leaves no image behind at all.